Russell Brand. I'll be talking to Professor Dr. Jordan Peterson. I've spoken to him before, but this special commemorative, well, it's not really a commemorative chat, it's not a tea towel for the royal wedding between Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. It's to celebrate the release on paperback of my book, Recovery. Look at it now on Amazon. It's £6.50, I think, might even be £6.47. We talk about that book, Recovery. We talk about the principles of recovery as a road to enlightenment. We talk about Dr. Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. It's an interesting chat, talking about myth. We do, of course, go through some of the mainstays of Professor Peterson's canon of ideas that he commonly talks about. But also I think we really get to the heart of it and discover some people think there's an exclusion of warmth, I think, sometimes when talking about Peterson's ideas and his insistence on individual culpability and responsibility. We get into that stuff quite deeply. I think it's a great chat. Those of you who don't know who Jordan Peterson is yet, where have you been? Obviously not watching him at the Hammersmith Apollo with 5,000 others. So yeah, we'll be talking to Jordan Peterson on Under the Skin. Thanks for joining me, and do check out my book, Recovery, on paperback. Thank you. Dr. Jordan Peterson, thank you for coming on Under the Skin. It's lovely to see you again.
It's good to see you too. It's nice to meet in London.
Yeah, it's different, isn't it? Both of us were exiled in Los Angeles in our last conversation, but I enjoyed it very much. I got a lot from it. I'm happy to talk to you on. This is very much home turf for me now.
Mm-hmm.
We're in London. We're in a publishing office. You have been promoting your book. I presume that's why you're here.
Yes, and doing a couple of public lectures.
How do you find that now? How are you finding... Well, I thought, in a way, I've been comparing you to the British opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, in that you've been doing this for ages, and now you're experiencing an almost perhaps unprecedented level of attention. But I'm assuming that your skill set is applicable. You're a lecturer, you're a clinical psychoanalyst, so it's not like, oh my God, there's cameras.
Right. Well, and I mean, the large-scale lectures I'm doing aren't that much different in kind from the lectures I was doing at the university. I mean, the venues are larger, but the
Hammersmith Apollo, 3,000 seats, I think, maybe more.
There were 5,000 at the Apollo.
Well, were you not nervous?
I'm not as nervous doing that as I am often going to talk to journalists.
Individual journalists?
Yeah, because like the thing about those venues, there's a variety of things about them that work in my favor. I mean, I like talking to crowds. You know, I've always enjoyed lecturing. And so lecturing to several thousand people isn't much different than lecturing to several hundred people. But I also know that the people who've come they're happy to be there. Like I'm speaking to a welcoming crowd. And so, and it's all of the details are essentially under my control. So it's not, I'm actually enjoying it quite a bit. I mean, I'm apprehensive beforehand because you should be, you know. I want to do a good job, and I want to make sure things go well, and I want to get through the material properly and get a little farther in my thinking than I have been. And I'm trying to make each time I lecture better than the last time, and I don't, obviously, I always don't succeed at that, but it's good. I'm enjoying it. And my wife is a very good travel companion. She's very stable, and she helps me plan my days. And so we've got it down to a bit of a routine, I would say.
Tammy is in the room with us. We have already met previously in Los Angeles. You won't be on mic. There isn't a mic, but it's just in case listeners are wondering why. Perhaps they might be able to detect in my voice that I'm occasionally glancing towards a spouse. The reason is because I am. Now, well, I'm curious. When you're... doing these lectures, is there not a performance component? Do you not feel like...
definitely.
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, a lecture theater is a theater, you know, and a lecture is a form of theater. Now, it's a serious form of theater, but theater can be serious, you know, and there's because partly what I'm doing is I'm presenting ideas to an audience, but I'm also modeling the act of engaging with ideas. And that's the theatrical end of it. And I don't give the same talk twice. Like, I have my stories and I have my collection of things I know and I talk about, but I try to do two things. I'm always talking to specific individuals in the audience. And so I'm having a conversation with the audience. And so That's part of the dynamic element of the performance. And the other thing I'm trying to do is to further my thinking on the topics that I'm addressing. And there is a theatrical element to that, because it's like, I think the closest thing really that it compares to is probably stand-up comedy. Although I think the routines that comedians have are probably more well and formally practiced than the ones that you know than the talks that I engage in. And I don't really think of it as delivering a lecture to an audience. I'm trying to think about complicated things in real time with an audience there to participate, and to use the audience as an indicator of whether what I'm saying is gripping and comprehensible.
Your apprehension and understandable adrenaline prior to going on stage doesn't lead you to lean into shtick, which would be the opposite of what you're describing, wanting to remain engaged in a kind of dialectic process of discovery. Because I find, obviously I am a comedian, so like for us, I would argue there is a distinction between performing before 200 people or 5,000 people. Around 200, I feel like I'm very relaxed, I'm comfortable, I feel like I've got a lot of space in there. 5,000, I feel like sharpen up now. You've got no room, particularly because the other crucial difference is there needs to be a laugh every 20-30 seconds. If there isn't, it gets pretty frosty up there. It's appealing to me as a comedian that's interested in furthering intellectual debate, looking at the new intersections between politics and spirituality. Perhaps they've always been there. These evaporating contexts, the emergence of new ideas, perhaps best exemplified by your own particular trajectory. It's interesting to me that these spaces are now becoming available for forms of types of performance that aren't so contingent.
It is
on rapture and applause.
Yeah, no, right. I know it is a very strange thing, and I'm not sure what to make of it. You see Sam Harris doing something quite similar. Richard Dawkins is doing something quite similar, and it's. I was thinking, because I've been trying to conceptualize this, and one comparable audience or one comparable situation is probably that of stand-up comedians. Another, I suspect, are traveling evangelical types.
Yeah.
Because they're but of course what they're doing is explicitly religious. This has elements of both of those. And what's emerging that's so interesting is that there's a clear public appetite for high-level intellectual conversation, if it's dynamic. And I don't know what's accounting for that all of a sudden. Maybe it's because these sorts of discussions aren't taking place like they should in the classical media space.
You might be right there, Jordan. To slightly mangle the Jung quote that you use in your book, 12 Rules, that I'm really enjoying, actually. One could infer motivation from results.
Right.
Perhaps it is that political discourse, social discourse has become superficial and detached from meaning, from purpose, from experience, that there is an opening appetite for substance, that people are starting to, and as you said about theatre before, the origins of theatre and the origins of religion are closely connected, and both of them still owe a debt, or at least functionally must relate to meaning, purpose, giving us stories that help illuminate the path that we're walking.
I think that's there's something about that that's profoundly correct. I think that that the New York Times has recently written about the rise of the so-called intellectual dark web, which is a term that Eric Weinstein so brilliantly coined, I would say, and very thoughtfully. I think that the thing that unites the people who are loosely grouped into that collection is that they are having serious conversations with an audience that they respect. And they're a very diverse range of people. They certainly don't, like Sam Harris and I disagree about many things, for example. But Sam respects his audiences, and he's engaging them in extremely serious discourse about very deep topics, about the structure of reality, actually, and the relationship between science and religion, and I think it is a consequence of the fact that not only has our public discourse, let's say in the media and in politics, become shallow, I think it's become unbearably shallow in the universities. So, yeah, well, because it's become so ideological, and it's just not helpful. Look, I was interviewed by a New York Times journalist last week. Nellie was her name. And she's going to publish this on Sunday. And she did a literature degree at Columbia. And she told me that she was quite appalled, actually, by her degree, especially in hindsight. She told me that she didn't know until she graduated that there was any other way of reading great literature than through a postmodern lens. And the postmodern lens takes a book, and basically you take a book, whatever it happens to be, and you decide which power hierarchy the author was serving and who or she has excluded from consideration. So it's completely read through a political lens, as if the book is nothing but a tool of political and economic domination, essentially. And that's the assumption. And look, everything's contaminated by politics and power to some degree, right? But that doesn't mean that there's nothing to art and literature except in service of group domination. It's an appalling way of looking at the world.
It would be an extraordinary bias to bring to Jane Eyre. It would be difficult to sort of make sense of it through that lens. Although, of course, economics and politics, of course, important themes are going to be present in great works of art. But I'm interested.
But there's still great works of art. Yes. That's the thing. And it's even with something as transient as comedy, let's say, I mean, you can't reduce comedy to the political or the economic. And comics who become too ideological, let's say, like musicians who become too ideological, they're just not funny anymore.
Yeah.
You have to be, I mean, you can have your viewpoint, left or right, that's fine, and people do, but you have to be able to transcend that viewpoint continually, and you have to be able to criticize it, because otherwise you're not amusing. You just become a demagogue of sorts.
Yes, I would agree that once there's a rubric to which you become enslaved, that it becomes dogmatic, then there's no room for nuance, there's no room for hypocrisy, humour, the transcendent, mirth, chaos. These forces need to be unleashed.
There's also things you can no longer laugh about, because you're so committed to your axioms, you dare not transgress against them. And if that's deadly, if you're a comedian, because the rule for comedy would be, and this is something I like about Sarah Silverman, for example, is she will say anything if she thinks it's funny. Like, she's very daring in that manner. And I've heard her tell jokes that, really would curl your hair, but you can tell by watching her, something will pop into her head and part of her goes, geez, I don't know if I should say this. And then she'll say it. And it's often horribly funny. And horribly funny is a good kind of funny. I mean, it's daring, and it's something I really admire about comedians too, is that they'll take that risk. And it's something also that I've found disturbing with regards to the many things I find disturbing about university campuses, is that so many comedians won't go perform on university campuses anymore because they can't be funny. People get offended, and it's a false offended.
I think you're right. I mean, I think it's like a kind of Simon Says type of, do you know that game? Do you have that game in your language? It's just there's certain things that we know we're not allowed to say. There's certain things that we know we're supposed to think. There's a kind of formulaic dance, a courtly behaviour, I've heard it referred to as, that we are meant to pay homage to a particular type, a set of protocols and manners, and it's not necessarily anchored to a real morality. It's not anchored to a sort of a sense of spirit, to a sense of love or kindness. It's about these are the rules that we abide by. I want to talk to you a bit about the 12 steps and the model for handling addiction that I've written about myself in my book Recovery, because I want to see what you think of it. The 12 steps have anonymous fellowships, which if I were to belong to them, I wouldn't be able to say I belong to them without breaching their code of anonymity. But what's positive about this approach to addiction is, as we've discussed off mic, that it creates community, like the other people that have got a similar endeavour. And in fact, it was Jung that identified this solution. He said that people that have got chronic addiction issues will struggle to change unless they have a spiritual realization of some kind and the support of a community.
Yeah. Well, and the spiritual realization component, that's actually supported by the relevant addiction literature. One of the classic cures for addiction is spiritual transformation. And the hardcore scientists have laid that out as a reality in the addiction literature.
I agree, because to use more secular language around that, a spiritual transformation could just be a change of perspective, a renewal.
It's a radical change of perspective.
Yeah. And typically in my experience, that's from a self-centered view, a self-obsessive view about getting your own needs met, a solipsistic, narcissistic perspective of life is just an adventure where I go around trying to accumulate and accrue, to, oh wow, I'm here to be of service. That's sort of the transition in
Right.
microscopically. But in addition to community, like having connections between one another, the 12 steps themselves, I think, are an interesting model for transformation and shouldn't be overlooked. And in fact, what my book was about is, could that method be transposed to anybody who's interested in change? So I wanted to talk to you about that to get your perspective on them. The first step is acknowledging that you are powerless over your addiction and that your life has become unmanageable. Just admitting I don't want to be in this situation.
So there's two parts to that admission. One is that you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And I guess there's three. You're in trouble and it's serious. Things could be better, and you don't have the wherewithal at the moment to make them better. So the thing that's interesting about that is there's a kind of radical humiliation and humility that goes along with that. So you say, I have a problem, and what I know at the moment isn't sufficient to solve it. Great, because now you've opened yourself up to the possibility of learning something. Because you say, well, I don't know enough to fix this. It's like, okay, well, you could learn. And one of the things that's so interesting about people is that if they decide they have a problem, and they also notice that they could learn, the probability that they will learn goes way up.
That's very interesting. You've actually conflated the first three steps there in your analysis of the first one, because the first one is admission that there's a problem. The second one is recognizing that things could improve, like coming to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the third one is made a decision to turn our life and our will over to the care of God as we understood God. So,
and we could talk about that from a secular perspective. Well, we could talk about that from a secular perspective and say, well, there's a higher order moral principle that needs to be brought into the situation. And you sort of described that right at the beginning of the question, because you said, well, partly what you do when you move from an addicted state, from a psychological perspective, is move from a viewpoint of the gratification of immediate desire and maybe the accumulation of things as a marker of success, to the notion that, no, you actually have a higher purpose, and that higher purpose might involve being of service. That could be of service to yourself, which means you wouldn't be addicted anymore, because that's not a good way of being of service to yourself, but of service to yourself and the broader community, however you might define that. That's a higher order purpose, and it can integrate your motivations at a level that doesn't leave you at the whim of impulse. That's the purpose of a higher order motivation. So, okay, so we've got three.
Yes, that's the first three, is to get you to that position where you're willing to change, believe in the possibility of change, and accept help in order to achieve that change.
Yep.
The fourth and fifth steps are about inventorying. This is where the 12-step program becomes a fusion of spirituality and psychoanalysis, because the fourth step is like a 4-column method where you write down a list of all your resentments in your life, your childhood resentments, your resentments against the government, people you work with. You write it all down, and then there's a diagnostic tool where you identify what it is in you that doesn't like that. And also interesting, for it to a degree. There is something in you that's being affected.
Yeah, you should at least ask yourself that question.
Yes.
Like, is it me or is it the world?
Yes.
It's like, well, let's consider first the possibility that it might be you. I wrote about that in the 6th rule, right? Put your house
Set
in
your
perfect
own
order.
house. Yes, yes. In fact, I've got our 2 rule. I did a truncated and somewhat more linguistically explicit, an expletive-laden version of the 12 steps, and I've got your 12 rules for life here, and they don't necessarily correlate. But because say your first one, stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's a great chapter, I think, and I love the lobster stuff and this sort of the ancient, timeless, almost roots of hierarchies and the chemicals that are at play. What's happening when you're what is at play when we talk about self-esteem. And this, the sixth one, set your own house in perfect order. I said before you criticize the world. Steps 4 and 5 in the in a 12-step program deal with that. Inventory what's going on in your life.
Right.
Inventory what your baggage is and your own personal
Well,
narrative.
you think it's very practical, Dad. It's like, well, let's say you want to fix up your house, which is actually quite a lot like fixing yourself up, which is a very common dream metaphor.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing you want to do is go look around and see what needs to be fixed. You know, and the interesting thing about that, and this is akin to what comedians do, is that as soon as you're willing to admit, comedians look at a problem and then rise above it right away and make a joke about it. But as soon as you're willing to admit that you have a problem, then you've immediately contacted the part of yourself that's at least strong enough to admit that you have a problem. And so the act of admitting the problem is actually the first step to solving it.
Yes.
You might say, well, and it's an optimistic step, because you might say, oh my God, I can't admit that I have a problem, because what if I can't solve it? Well, exactly. So then maybe you won't admit to it. If you do admit to it, you're simultaneously admitting to the possibility that you could solve it.
Yes.
And then it can actually become something that's optimistic. You can say, well, my life is horrible. It's like, okay, but I'm doing 50 things wrong. Well, great, I could fix those things, and then maybe it wouldn't be so horrible.
The admission itself demonstrates progression and possibility for further progression.
Exactly.
I think it relates
That's
to
why humility is always stressed in great religious traditions. Humility is precisely that. It's like you have to look at why you're not so good. You have to, and you know, that has to break down your pride to some degree and your arrogance. It's like, well, that's great, because if you break down your pride and your arrogance, then you're primed to learn and you can solve your problems. So there's nothing in that. It's a bit crushing to begin with, because you might think, oh my God, there's really a lot of things wrong with me.
Yes.
But at least then you're on the road to fixing them.
My personal journey of recovery has been like a kind of death. When I was 27, it was like the death of the drug addict self. That guy died.
That's funny, because I told Tammy when we were coming here today that when you were 27, you made the decision to live.
Yes.
I knew it was 27, because that's when people, I'm going to say like you, but celebrities who are sort of on fire, they die all the time at 27, because they don't make that decision. They don't decide that they're going to take that final step into maturation. They want to hold on to that Peter Pan thing, that possibility.
Pluriturnis.
You bet. Exactly that. They want to hold on to that, and you can't hold on to that and live.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then there's a further death I'm noticing now in my early 40s, that now at the midway point, at the midway, in a sort of Dante-esque way, and now I'm moving towards the grave, and now I'm like, there's a different kind of alertness emerging. And back to this step 4 and 5 moment, this process of inventorying. After you've made an inventory and you've honestly and openly put down everything, incidents of child abuse, things that you've said to other people, things that your shame, once you've been willing to inscribe your shame, then you tell another person, a person that you trust. In the original literature, it says, it could be a cleric, a doctor, or whatever. Typically in 12-step structures, it's like a mentor figure. But that's the role of confession, which is obviously a huge part of psychoanalysis. The point in your book that I think this pertains to is when you talk about the dragon, and like the dragon, you said there was that kid's book that you read where it talks about the dragon getting bigger and bigger if it's not identified. I think 4 and 5 are somewhat like that.
And part of the point of that kid's book is that as soon as you turn around and look at something, it tends to shrink. And that's partly because imagine that you have a memory that you won't confront. Well, there's something in that memory that's terrifying. And that means it's sort of associated with everything else that's terrifying. And so it's horrible. But then when you turn around and look at it, you think, yeah, it's horrible, but it's horrible in this precise and defined way. And that takes it away from all the other potential horrors of it. It starts to shrink it right away. It also makes you into the thing that can turn around and look at the horror, which is a real positive transformational act on your part. So
that's true, that somehow in being prescriptive and being specific, the problem becomes manageable, because otherwise it's limitless. It's potential. It becomes apocalyptic in the end. What's the worst thing that's happened is I could be destroyed, and everyone I love could be destroyed, and Earth itself could be destroyed. And until you say, well, actually, no, what this is you feel inadequate because you weren't role modeled correctly.
Right.
There's, right, well, I can maybe take care of that.
Right, that's still bad, but it's not everything. And then you phrased that exactly right, is that without that attentive delimiting, it becomes apocalyptic. That's a very, very old idea. So one of the things that happens in the Mesopotamian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, is that the gods are created. They're the offspring of chaos. That's a good way of thinking about it. And they become very careless, and they destroy their category system. They destroy their father, essentially, and chaos comes flooding back. And that's what happens to people who aren't looking at things and delimiting them properly. They become apocalyptic and do them in. So,
but sometimes in mythology there is the positive confronting of the god, e.g. Prometheus. So sometimes we need to steal the fire. Sometimes we need to challenge these orthodoxies, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, part of the death that you're describing is actually the confrontation with a form of tyrant. Like, your previously addicted self was the tyrant over your emergent self.
Yes.
And so it's an internal tyrant, and you said it was predicated on a false value system. That's a false set of gods, essentially. And so you had to confront that. That is a kind of death.
I also think that the addiction or addictive tendencies, and I don't mean as severe as chemical dependency, all forms of addiction are a kind of self-constructed formaldehyde to preserve you in the state of trauma. That trauma is acknowledged. No means to navigate trauma are present because of the isolation, because you have no mentor, you have no doctrine, you have no community. So addiction steps in. This is how I will preserve. This is how I will not die. I will find this notice that it's a habit, a repeated pattern to sustain you, a holding pattern so that you don't die, because there is no way out. There's no guide. There's no path. You're just in the forest and there isn't a way out. So I feel that addiction, for personal experience, and I hope and suspect more broadly, is a means for sort of stasis, for preservation after trauma. The rupture occurs, is not addressed, and a means for survival emerges in the form of addiction. Addiction is not your nemesis; it is your friend, at least whilst you're in it.
Well, there's certainly a literature on addiction that indicates that many people use addictive substances as a form of self-medication, and they tend to find the drug that best medicates them, let's say. And for different people, that's different drugs.
Yes,
so
or
some
even
people,
gambling.
it's alcohol. Yeah.
I think now, see, one of the other things that I'm proposing in my book, is to use rather grandiose terminology, is that the template for a recovery from obvious forms of addiction could be applicable to less evident forms of addiction, i.e., just patterns and habits, because.
Well, so far the things you've laid out would be in keeping with that idea.
Would they?
Well, you admit to the problem.
Yeah.
I really also, I think the idea of laying out your resentments is unbelievably useful, because that's also a way of dealing with the malevolence within you that might interfere with your own recovery.
Yes.
Like, if you're angry at yourself, if you're angry at your parents, if you're angry at the world, the probability that you're going to be in the mental state that's going to allow you to chart a positive course for yourself is very, very low.
How can you have a clear and authentic relationship with your wife if you've not correctly understood what you feel about your own mother? If you feel like that you are enmeshed or trapped in some way, how am I supposed to have if I've not understood that, if I've not gained a new perspective, if I've not transcended it by sharing with another person?
You see that in the Sleeping Beauty story, in the Disney story, when the prince is encapsulated in the castle, in the dungeon at the end. And before he goes and rescues Sleeping Beauty, he has to confront his terrible mother. She turns into the dragon of chaos itself. He has to use honesty and truth to confront her. And until he does that, he can't free the maiden from her sleep.
Yes.
So that's called the freeing of the anima from the negative mother archetype in Jungian psychology. It's precisely that. And that negative feminine will be overlaid on your partner unless you're able to clarify it and clarify your relationship with it. And that could be something like overprotection, or it could, in your past, or it could be neglect, for that matter, or it could be the rejection at the hands of many, many women before you encountered this woman.
Yes.
And you're going to bring that bitterness forward as a kind of projection.
If we are unwilling to undertake this kind of excavation, then we are doomed to continually have relationships that are cutaneous. Just the superficial coordinates will govern our experience of relationship.
Yes. That's the repetition compulsion from a Freudian perspective. That isn't how Freud explained it. That's how a Jungian would explain it. But the simple explanation of it is, well, if you bring the same set of unexamined presuppositions to every situation, the same fate will play out. You might say, well, all those women are the same. It's like, well, actually, no. but the part of them that you're able to make contact with acts the same every time. That's a very
Yes.
different thing.
Brilliant. And this is where 6 and 7, the next steps chronologically occur. Like that 6, having done this inventory, you recognise what patterns have been at play in your life, which particular, in the lexicon of the recovery, defects of character have governed you. Often pride, wanting to control other people's perspective, self-pity, self-centeredness, intolerance, impatience, greed, jealousy, envy, lust, sloth.
Right. That's where you identify the 7 deadly sins and how they play out in your life, essentially.
Yes, and so and you become in the step 6 is about becoming willing to live differently, like saying, are you actually willing to let go of lust?
Right.
Are you, or do you like lust when it comes to it? Do you like being impatient? Does it serve you in some way to be slothful? You know,
And it's highly probable that it does.
yes,
You know, it's easy, it's gratifying, it's powerful, it's pleasurable, especially in the short term. Like there are reasons that people are tempted by the 7 deadly sins. I mean,
yes,
they're
they are
tempting.
kind of glorious.
Oh,
They're dark
absolutely.
glory and beauty.
That's right. They have
allure.
that's exactly right. There's a dark romanticism, and you really see that in the deaths of celebrities around 27. Is they fall in love with the allure of that kind of that romantic death, and it does them in.
Sort of the anti-libido, the dark libido, the death force.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have diagnosed which particular defects of character have been most prominent in your path and become willing to let go of them, this, like it's step 7, is making a concerted and real effort to live without them. And this is where it kind of becomes...
That's a sacrifice there, eh? That's what are you willing to sacrifice in order to move forward? You have to give up something that you love, and you may have to give up the thing you love the best.
Yes.
That's the fundamental sacrificial motif.
Sacrifice is an unattractive idea in our society that's based on consuming and indulgence, and this is not something that I would lay. So this is again perhaps where you and I somewhat differ. Is that I would not, whilst this will not change without the individual's engagement, a kind of step 1, an acknowledgement that it needs to be changed. This is where I say there is a social responsibility that, for whatever reason, our society has become a manifestation of these darker impulses. These are the prevalent forces, at least in the kind of society I live in. I don't know what it's like to live in China or Libya. I'm just saying, like in London, like what you're
Too
hit
much
with.
emphasis on immediate gratification.
Too much emphasis on, because immediate gratification is a tool of consumerism. This would be my argument. So, like, but at this point in the program, it's where the spirituality becomes, I find personally, undeniable. That you have to call to something else. You have to, in a sense, lay yourself open. The idea of prayer becomes quite important. Now,
So there's a Jungian idea there. So the Jungian self is the thing that guides the ego through transformations. So imagine the ego, which is what you think you are. Well, the thing about the ego is that the ego can be wrong, and the ego can die and be reborn. So what that indicates is that there's something underneath the ego that can guide that process of transformation. And partly what you're calling on when you call on this higher power is, at least from a psychological perspective, it's a decision to rely on that thing that can guide you through transformations.
Yes, because surely, as we said, in relation to another, we are likely relating to a set of coordinates that we impose on, inverted commas, the female. The same would be true of the self, that we have created an impression, an egoic impression. We have constructed an artificial self, but beneath it there is a higher self or an ulterior self that can
it's often composed of things that you refused to or weren't willing to develop. And so when Jung talks about, for example, the incorporation of the shadow, is that you've constructed an ego and there's things it can do and can't do, that it's allowed to do and it isn't allowed to do. And then there's a shadow domain that would consist of those things that you could do but haven't. And some of that's terrible, but some of it's what you need to break free.
Is there infinite variety in the shadow, or are there sort of templates there? Would you say that, a common component of the shadow is aggression?
Aggression and lust are the two, because they're the two that are most
uncivilized.
Yeah, they're the two that are most difficult to integrate into the ego, because aggression destroys, and of course lust subsumes the individual to sexual desire.
It's lust is identified as a very powerful self. It can subsume. So I suppose that's why a lot of theological doctrines focus on the control of lust. And there is, of course,
it's a disruptive force, because, for example, if you make a medium to long-term relationship with someone and you negotiate that, that provides you with a stable structure that can operate across your entire life. It's good for you, it's good for them, it's good for your kids, it's good for society. But then if you're really attracted to someone momentarily, you can be driven to act on that, and all the rest of that can burn up. It's not good. And so it's no wonder that it's viewed as a force of tremendous disruption. Now, it's also a force of tremendous life, right? Because you want to be attracted to people. You want to have that vital libido as part of what's driving you forward, but hopefully it's on your side and not working against you. And so, if you're successful and you've put yourself together and you're disciplined, you should still be maximally sexually attractive, but it should be under your control. You're not the puppet of that force anymore. It's integrated into you. And that's a much better way to manage it.
How do you, in your understanding, how is the shadow incorporated? What rituals, what ceremonies, what behaviours successfully incorporate the shadow? Say, using the example of lust, what's a way back in for the sort of for lust that has been disembodied or repressed? What is a safe way for it back in? Is there one?
Well, I think part of it is to admit to your desires within your own relationship. Because you might say, well, I'm tired of my wife. It's like, well, yeah, maybe you're tired of the games that you're intelligent enough to play with your wife, but she's as pluripotential as you are. And so you have to admit to your desires, let's say, and maybe you have to make them consciously manifest within your own relationship. And then, and people can do that. People do that by dressing up or by playing sexually, I would say.
Yeah, play.
Because by play, exactly that. And play is a transformative element. And that should be, and it might be that you're uncomfortable with the idea of your wife as sexual plaything because you think that a woman who's married should be proper and prim and should only behave sexually in a certain way. In which case, well, that becomes sterile and dull and you're more likely to be tempted by something on the outside.
For me, that's a very obvious example of how habitualized thinking is prohibitive even without reaching the extremes of self-destructive addictive tendencies. If I have a habit of regarding my wife as object A, even if that's not objectification as we typically take it, but limiting beliefs about my wife, the tools that break down addictive thought patterns could be used to create new terrains, new liberty, new play. Thank you. So once you've done up to step 7, which is essentially step 7, you're right, it's sort of sacrifice of the old self and handing over stolen that, I shouldn't have done that, I treated that person badly, that was wrong, I lied. So it's moral. It becomes quite a moral
and
process.
That's a real repentance, right? And atonement. Atonement is at one meant.
Yes.
And if you're carrying transgressions that you regard as transgressions now in your life, then you don't want to carry those forward. You want to step forward in life without that moral burden, because you'll have contempt for yourself otherwise, and you won't take care of yourself.
Also, in a sense, what we were talking about allowing lust back in, incorporating lust. Just then, this is a broader method for incorporating annexed aspects of the self. Like, how can I fully love myself if I know I treated that person abominably? Well, if I go back and say that was wrong, I did you wrong, I owe you an amends. You invite that part of your life in. You amend your path through life, as well as teaching yourself that is not the way we proceed anymore. That's step 8.
And that's a real that's taking out, that's real action in the world. It's not a hypothetical at that point, right?
Yes,
it's kind of like telling people what you've written down about your faults.
Yes.
Because it makes it real when you're acting it out with someone else. It's not only a mental thing at that point.
And doesn't it furthermore indicate step 8 is done separate from the step 8 is right up the list of people. Step 9 is now go do it.
Right.
It makes the distinction, I think, to create a space for you where you're not continually thinking, I'm not fucking doing that. I'm not going to apologise. I was abused by them. Fuck that. They did as much wrong as I did.
Yeah. Which is not the point, right?
It's not the point. No. And also, I think
they might have done more wrong than you did.
Yes.
But you're still stuck with the fact that you did something wrong.
That's right.
That's not good.
And if you refuse to surmount the obstacle of some arbitrary measure of who is more wrong, then you continue to cast yourself in victimhood.
Yeah, that's
but you have no personal autonomy.
That's exactly
you
right.
can't choose to go through
It
your life.
It doesn't matter if you're only 5% at fault. And it also doesn't matter if the other person apologizes to you. They should. It would be better for them. It might make things lay out. That's not the point.
And this perhaps is where what I think is significant, that now your life has become not a negotiation between you and other beings as they materially present themselves, but between yourself and this higher purpose that has been declared earlier, that you are now operating on the, in inverted commas, spiritual plane. You are no longer about, if I do that, I'll get that. It precisely doesn't matter if the other person goes, I don't care if you apologise or not,
See,
fuck
in
off.
religious language, that would be expressed as the discovery of your Father in heaven instead of your earthly father, because your Father in heaven would be the higher spiritual authority to which you owe allegiance. And you can think about that either in religious terms or in non-religious terms, is that what you've done is you've, in some sense, is you've abstracted the idea of a higher authority and a higher purpose, and you've decided to devote yourself to that. That's a religious act.
And that's precisely antithetical to postmodernism. It's saying that no, there is an essence, there is a code,
That's right.
there is a way, there is a truth.
That's right. That's what is precisely antithetical. Yes, because the postmodern claim is that there are multiple ways of looking at the world, many ways, and that's true. But the antithesis of that is, yes, just because there's multiple ways of looking at the world doesn't mean there are multiple proper ways of looking at the world.
Yes.
In fact, there's a very narrow range of proper ways of looking at the world.
My concern with atheism has always been its sort of easy affiliation with nihilism. Or why don't we just wander in the street and start fucking people then? That's where my mind immediately goes.
Right,
if
right.
there is not an order, why not just smash everything
Of
to
course.
smithereens? And you're saying ideologically that is what's happening. Ideologically, we're deconstructing God, we're deconstructing morality, we're
And that was the
deconstructing
danger.
gender, we're deconstructing.
That's right. And that was the danger that both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky pointed to clearly. It's like you dispense with the transcendent principle and you open up the landscape for impulsive nihilism.
What are they responding to? Post-Enlightenment rationalism? Is that what Dostoevsky and Nietzsche are responding to? Why are they
They were
writing about that then?
responding essentially to the idea of the death of God. Both of them. And that explicitly.
And is that
because
an Enlightenment idea? Like, where is death of God happening prior
be at
to
the
Nietzsche?
be at the hands of a kind of arrogant and narrow rationalism and a materialism. Yeah.
And the exposition of, the exponentially that has led us to where we're going now, which is a kind of, okay, we're sort of digging the earth from beneath our feet and
Right.
putting ourselves
That's right.
into the abyss.
That's right. That's the hypothesis precisely. Yeah.
Yes. 10, 11, the last three steps. Step 10 is continue to make inventory. So let this process continue. For me, in psychoanalytic terms, I see a therapist obviously. Is when there's a moment, I know any spike in my energy. If I go, I felt that was interesting. I felt jealous there, or
Yeah.
I felt small in that
Yeah,
moment.
right, exactly.
These are the moments I know and go, how was I participating in that? What belief of mine was being challenged? Is that a helpful belief? Belief being a thought that I like having. 11.
Right, that's a kind of consciousness. It's like, well, I'm going to fall apart. I'm going to make mistakes. I don't want to make mistakes. I'm going to keep an eye out for when I do make mistakes, and I'm going to make them conscious, and then I'm going to try to work on them.
Yes, bringing them into consciousness, because my number one fear on a personal level, and possibly on a social level, I don't know quite how to extrapolate or conflate those two notions, is unconsciousness. I get very afraid when I'm dealing with unconscious individuals, when people don't know why they're doing what they're doing. You may see this in sort of violent rage, or even in less dramatic or theatrical behaviours.
There's the great idea that lurks at the bottom of the Christian mythological tradition is that a little bit of consciousness destroyed the original paradise. We became conscious enough to be aware of our own mortality. But the cure for that is way more consciousness, not a return to unconsciousness.
Yes, there's no
Right.
going back. There's no
no.
going back. I sometimes think the plethora of zombie movies is, they don't know they're already dead.
That danger of the zombie is the danger of the desire for unconsciousness as a solution to life's problems.
And I think that this is again something we're being invited to participate in through consumerism, that live your life continually on the frequency of unconscious energy such as desire and fear. That we're not being invited to participate on the level of consciousness, conscious interaction, presence in the moment.
Well, you could make that case if you made the case that consumerism promotes the gratification of immediate desires above all else.
I think it does. That's what I'm pushing for. So with this original sin, a little bit of consciousness is a dangerous thing. We become aware of our vulnerability, our mortality,
that's
our
right.
nakedness, our corporeal nature. But the solution to this is to
become more conscious.
Do we have to? So how was that?
Well,
Is
you
that the whole
outlined
rest
some
of
of
the
it.
Bible?
Yes, I would say so.
Like,
Yes.
I was wondering, where does that get resolved? Not
Yeah.
when they get kicked out of the garden.
Well,
not when Cain slays
look,
Abel.
well, part of what happens in the redemptive story is, if you think about Christ as a symbolic figure, say a symbolic of the process of transformation that we just described, is one of the morals of the Christian passion is that you need to radically accept your limitations. And so part of this keeping your sins before your eyes, which you just described, here's all the ways that I fall short of the glory of God, let's say. You know, I make this mistake, I make this mistake, I make this mistake. That's all consciousness. And it's painful, right? Because you think, well, you become more conscious. It's this glorious process of enlightenment. And overall it is, but the details are exactly this. The things you need to become conscious of are precisely those things that you least want to become conscious of. And that this is the motif that Jung identified in the alchemical tradition, because the alchemical motto, so to speak, was that which you most need to be found, that which you most need to find will be found where you least want to look.
Yeah.
Right. Yes, and everyone knows that's true. Like you tell someone that, they go, oh yeah, I know that's true. So, and that's also the greatest barrier to enlightenment, because if enlightenment was all, tulips and sunshine, then everyone would be enlightened. But it's not. It's this continual bringing before yourself all your proclivity for transgression. And and obviously, because how are you going to solve your problems if you're not aware of them?
People don't want the old discipline, do they, Jordan?
Well, it's not surprising. But the alternative is far worse. That's the thing. And that is because I was very curious. Like I said, I talked about this with Tammy when we were coming here. I thought, Russell decided to live when he was 27. I would like to know why. So why did you?
Well,
Why did you make the decision to not allow what was consuming you to kill you?
In a sense, it was taken out of my hands. For the first time, I encountered positive male authority figures, curiously, or at least that were able to address that in particular. I was sent to a treatment centre. I had 3 months. I had time to think. I had time to... I passed from childhood directly into addictive behaviours. In fact, those addictive behaviours were already present in childhood in a less toxic form. My relationship, in retrospect, with chocolate was addictive. My relationship with pornography as an adolescent, addictive. I was using it for medical purposes. So when substances became an option in adolescence, it was seamless, and that meant that my emotional growth was arrested at that point. The reason I was able to stop is because I was offered help. I was given help by people that the management company that I was working with said, "You're a serious drug addict. You should go away."
Okay, so partly that meant that they regarded you as the sort of valuable commodity that was worth preserving.
Yes, there was a degree of that.
Right. Well, no, but that's helpful. I mean,
thank
regardless of even if it's purely an economic interest, there's something to that.
Yes.
And so then you went into treatment and you found some people.
Curiously, the place that I went was run by an atheist, Chip Summers. But the 12-step principles, you can't unpick it from the Oxford group, first century For me, it's more appealing when you talk about it in Jungian terms. Although I have no problem with the sublime and the divine, I live for that shit. But like I was always trying to get out of my head, off my face. Those were the things I wanted: a sublime experience, an experience of what is beyond the material.
Right.
That's what I want to know. So but once I was in that environment and given drugs to help with, I was addicted to opiates, so I was given a drug called Subutex then, and sleeping pills because I couldn't sleep. And during that time, I suppose in a way I didn't fully address the issue of addiction because I was really promiscuous for about a decade. That behaviour was transplanted kind of effortlessly. But I do remember a kind of moment of epiphany, if epiphany is revelation of previously concealed truth, when it first occurred to me, I suppose you don't have to take drugs every day. I remember that thought entering and it being sort of like, oh yeah, I'd never thought about that, because I'd found a solution. It worked. It worked as a way of managing pain, preventing further mental investigation or discovery of conclusions that would have been unhelpful and that I wouldn't have been able to deal with. I think in a lot of cases, and I'm sure there's many, many variables, that actually chemical dependency is a successful technique for preventing suicide. It's just, this is a holding pattern to stop me doing something more dramatic. And unless people have access to an ideology, a structure and support that will help them through that, it's very difficult to overcome. And I was fortunate in that I was granted that, and then granted this system. And so, as I've been working it, I've come to the conclusion that it is possibly universal, because I think it's derived from universal ideas. That's why I think Jung made that identified. Oh, if there's a spiritual experience and then the support of a community, that's how someone could be stopped from drinking continually, alcoholic drinking. And then they took this process, the original 12-step fellowships, took the Oxford group had a program of sort of redemption and restitution, and and like it seems initially I think in a materialistic society counterintuitive to think that the solution to addiction is going to be spiritual awakening, but that's what it is. And the final steps are stay connected. Once you are like you're continually inventorying for the moments where you think, oh, I felt something there, that you want to be in the moment, connected. Like, and I have to notice if someone makes me feel inferior, or if I'm sexually attracted to someone, those are the most obvious examples of something that will take me out of my connection. And the final step is help others,
right,
and remain awake.
Right. Well, that's the end of the hero's journey. Is once you go into the darkness and find something of value, the next thing to do is to distribute it within the community, to bring it back and distribute it within the community. Yeah.
Now, Jordan, is it like it would be difficult for me to accept that you've not been sort of personally affected and are not personally angry rather than just objectively, because your personal trajectory, I suppose, in the public eye at least, began with the situation in Canada with sort of what you call forced speech, or however it's termed now. So like are you able to distinguish between your sort of sense of personal irritation? Because I think for most people, and tell me whether or not you think this is right, that academia seems like an ancillary area. It doesn't seem mainstream to most people, but to you it seems sort of very vital. But you are an academic.
Well, okay. So there's two things there. I mean, people regard academia as ancillary, but it's not. The reason it's not is because the universities train the people who run things, and so whatever's mainstream in the universities right now, even though it's separate from society, is going to be mainstream everywhere 5 years down the road. And so that's a big problem.
You think it's the vanguard, academia?
Oh, definitely. No, there's no doubt about it.
Do you think what's happening now in terms of media and politics, you could say, you could preemptively have diagnosed that from what was happening 5-10 years ago?
I think that in some sense I was preemptively diagnosing it, because I've been watching the politically correct postmodern types for quite a long time. And one of the things I noticed about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there were two things that I noticed that I really didn't like. The first is that because I'm a personality psychologist, as a researcher, not as a clinician, but as a researcher, I know the literature on gender differences in personality because it's part of my field. And I could tell that I was starting to have some reluctance to deliver the lecture on gender differences. Now, I didn't stop, but I felt that I was treading on thin ice by delivering those lectures. And I thought, oh, that's not good, because I'm like a comedian. I'm pretty much willing to say anything that I think is true, and regardless of the consequences in some sense, because I'd rather take the consequences of what's true. And I thought, this isn't good, because if someone like me, who's, rather uncontrollably mouthy, let's say, is starting to have second thoughts about teaching what's a very serious topic and something about which there's a very well-developed science, then how much are other people starting to censor? And at the same time, my students, many of whom were female, were telling me that they were really hesitant to talk about gender differences in any of the courses they were running. And I thought, oh, this is not good. This is seriously not good. And it's certainly the case that my colleagues censor themselves increasingly on campus with regards to the topics they're willing to discuss. And it's subtle, because imagine in a given lecture, I could discuss any of 10 things, and 3 of them are taboo. Well, I just won't discuss those, and that's a kind of invisible censorship. It's not like I'll get up and say, look, I could have talked to you about gender differences in personality, but I won't because I'm afraid. I'll just pick another topic because there's lots of topics to choose from. And that means there's going to be a bunch of topics that are really important because actually the issue of sex differences in personality happens to be really important that people just won't talk about. And the other thing that's so annoying about this is that, especially with regards to sex differences in personality, let's say that you're firmly on the side of women, just for the sake of argument. Well, do you admit to or deny the existence of sex differences in personality? What's better for women? Well, the radical leftists basically say, oh, well, if you talk about sex differences, then you're part of the oppressive patriarchy and you're attributing to women a different kind of temperament in the attempt to continue the suppression. But I could just as easily say, it's like, well, wait a second. Like, if you want to give the individual the greatest degree of freedom, you say, look, you're different from another person. You're different on the basis of a variety of your characteristics, sex being one of them. That's going to have some effect on what sort of choices you want to make in your life. It's like, go ahead and make whatever choices you want, as far as they're a direct expression of your being. And so if you deny the existence of these sex differences, which no serious commentator in the psychological literature, in the personality domain, and those are the people who know about this thing, nobody debates whether or not sex differences in personality exist, or that they have a biological component. And what's also interesting about that is that none of those people are conservatives. There are no conservative psychological researchers to speak of. They're in a tiny minority. So the people that have done the research indicating that there are differences between the sexes in personality, and that those differences have in part a biological component, those are liberal and left-leaning people who've drawn those conclusions, despite what their ideological presuppositions might have suggested to them to begin with. So, I don't know what to say about that, except that it's all appalling.
I suppose the fear must be that difference will ultimately be used for leverage for status.
Sure, and that's a reasonable fear. Because anything can be manipulated, but claims of identity claims that people are identical in some way can also be used for the same reason. If I insist that everyone is exactly the same on all dimensions, that there's just as much of a totalitarian threat lurking in there as there is the threat lurking that we'll use differences as an excuse.
Yes.
And we're also not having a serious discussion about this. It's like, yeah, men are overrepresented at the top of the economic apex. That's true. It's a small minority of men, by the way. It's certainly not men in general, but they're radically overrepresented at the bottom. And believe me, man, like, nobody cares about men who are failures. They are like off the bloody radar.
Yeah.
So and there's no sympathy for men who are failures. So men stack up at the top and the bottom. And we don't have a discussion about that. And we don't have a discussion about the fact that women are radically underrepresented in dangerous jobs, although they are, or in trades that require like brutal physical labor. Women are radically underrepresented, or in jobs outside, women are radically underrepresented. So the complaint is always, well, if you look at the top 1%, there are more men than there should be, by pure sex division. It's like, well, yeah, but if you look at the bottom, the reverse is true. So if we're going to have the discussion, I don't really necessarily think we should have that discussion, but if we're going to have the discussion, then we should look across the entire economic spectrum.
I wonder how much of this debate is being governed by unconscious forces. I wonder how much of what we're experiencing is a manifestation of a sort of where cartography has not yet been. I think that
a lot of it. What are you thinking about? Any particular part of it?
What I feel like is that the reason that I imagine that your arguments that are based on research are so successful is because people are expressing feelings as opposed to cogent and researched arguments. It feels like there is a powerful, dominant patriarchy, and no one can deny, I mean, that there is power, there's such a thing as power, and there are people that benefit from structures being as they are.
Of course.
That's the point of those structures being the way they are. One of the things I've observed is that whenever change is discussed, and my tendency has always been to be sympathetic towards movements that are about change or empowerment of what might be termed disadvantaged groups. That change is all that when you're curious about the resistance of change or the difficulties that you face when trying to bring about change, look at who would be negatively impacted were that change to be brought about. And usually that means that there's some people for who, conservatism makes sense to a particular group of people. Mm-hmm. One of the things I felt when reading a book was that, because I think you're coming from a perspective of psychoanalysis, and it rings the language rings true and the analysis rings true. Where I feel, one question I was keen to bring to you is when you talked about skateboarders in I think it's the last but one chapter, and that spirit of a young people, courage and a willingness to try dangerous things and to push forward. I wonder how that sits with the idea of an earlier passage in the book where you talk about the gratitude that we should feel for, having time to read a book and the ability to read a book, and sort of respect for the establishments and systems that have been set up from which we all benefit. Because when I could find it difficult to dispute your opinion about sort of churlish, what would have been in the lexicon of the day, social justice warriors, and that kind of somewhat rootless, unresearched rage. I identify what you're saying there. People that can't keep their bedrooms tidy, you be careful before you let them organise an economic system. But similarly, where is change going to come from? Who is going to challenge tyranny? Yeah. Is it going to be?
Those are the sorts of twin forces that we have to contend with across the political spectrum. So I could run through something quickly to put the things that you just brought up in perspective. Let's say. Okay. So the first thing is that hierarchies, if you're going to value some things more than others, then hierarchies are inevitable. And you have to value some things more than others, or you don't have anything valuable.
Like beauty or strength or something.
Or competence, or whatever it happens to be. The ability to play the flute, right? It doesn't matter what it is.
High on my list.
Well, obviously, if you value music, then you're going to value some musicians more than others because some are better. So you have to value things in order to move forward in life, and you have to value things in order to have something valuable to produce. But if you play out the value in a social landscape, you're going to produce a hierarchy. And the problem with producing a hierarchy is that a small number of people are going to be more successful than the majority, and a very large number of people aren't going to be successful at all at that particular thing. It's inevitable. So, okay, now, so you must say, well, we have to put up with that because we need to pursue things of value. Okay, fine. So that's the right-wing perspective, is that the hierarchies are justifiable and necessary. Now, the left-wing perspective is, but wait a minute. The problem with hierarchies is that people stack up at the bottom and that they tilt towards tyranny across time. And that's also true. And so you need that dialectic in society between the right wing that says, we need the hierarchies and they're useful and you should be grateful for them, and they structure you and give you form and provide value, and the left that says, but they exclude people and people stack up at the bottom, and that's dangerous to the hierarchy itself, and it means that people might not have opportunity, and you have to say yes to that. The problem comes, and this is the situation we're in right now, where the radical leftists, and this is mostly a problem that really permeates the universities, the radical leftists say, but all hierarchies are just tyrannical power. It's like, oh no, they're not. Hierarchies are based on competence in a functioning society, and mostly our society functions. So you can't go that far. Now, that doesn't mean that hierarchies don't tilt towards self-interest and tyranny across time, but that's a bad thing. It's even a bad thing from the conservative perspective. So there's room for the left. There's room for the left because the poor will always be with us. That's the reason that there's room for the left, and that the dispossessed need a voice, not least because there are talented people among the dispossessed, and if they're stuck at zero, everyone suffers because we don't have access to their talents. It's bad use of resources. But on the right, it's like, no, We need the damn value hierarchies, and we need to be grateful for our traditions and our structures because they stop us from degenerating into chaos.
Also, across our society, numerous hierarchies emerge, and at some point decisions are being made about which thing, is it being a brilliant flautist or brilliant at tennis or brilliant at owning land or controlling energy resources or dominating financial systems? Which are the hierarchies that are most important? And also that it's the way that resources are designated, and challenging those hierarchies seems to become, well, almost impossible. When I was leaving the hospital, the brilliant hospital that's been taking care of my mother recently, I sort of like, when at the level of crisis and trauma and tragedy, they are excellent. They've got the sort of the best doctors. The guy Martin Griffith that operated on her bowel, he's like a fantastic surgeon. It's in fact him that Trump was quoting when he talks about European hospitals with blood spattered floors from knife crime. It was a sort of a mangling of a quote that this Martin Griffith had given. And then sort of like I step outside, like I'm driving along Whitechapel Road, and there are electronic advertising boards, and that require energy to tell me to eat, McDonald's or Kit Kats or whatever. And there's so much poverty on that street. There always has been in that part of East London, terrible poverty. And I feel there are moments when I helicopter out to the macro, a perspective that no individual can long hold, a weight that can't be long borne. But in that moment, I think, why is this hospital struggling for resources when we can afford to run electronic adverts for McDonald's? Who gets to decide how collectively and individually do we determine where resources and where power, both in terms of energy but also in terms of human power, end up? How are these decisions made? And as you say, among the dispossessed, there are great resources, great talent. One would imagine, if the research were possible, to the exact same degree as there is power and talent among the possessed, because it's normally an accident of birth that decrees. And reading about your early life in Canada in a blue-collar community and the sort of the mental health issues and the anger and agitation that grows there, so much of that is about resources, the dispossession of the native people of that area, the mental health issues of your friend Chris. Like that, for me, we that are rising through these hierarchies, we that have experiences of both sides of that line, well, we are now challenging this evolutionary force. We are now in a position to talk about these hierarchies, how they're ordered and how they're organised, and whether there is room for negotiation.
Well, it's up to us to do that. Because
we mustn't we?
So
don't you think there's a risk in conservatism of saying, well, this is how the cards have fallen? And
of course there is. That is the risk in conservatism.
So how do we confront that?
Well, the risk is that the hierarchies ossify and turn to stone, and then there's no mobility. And the idea that things can turn to stone and they become tyrannical is an extraordinarily old idea. For example, in the story of Exodus, the story of Moses, so the Egyptians are portrayed in that story as tyrannical conservatives, essentially, right? And they're masters of stone. And Moses is a master of water, and water is the thing that dissolves. And so that drama is being played out in these stories that are thousands of years old. And in the Egyptian story, the ancient Egyptian story of Osiris and Horus, Osiris is the old king who becomes too rigid. And what happens to him is that he's dismembered by evil. That's the consequence. And so even the Egyptians long ago knew that the danger of hierarchies is they become static and corrupt and tyrannical. And so part of what we do in our ongoing political dialogue, and when it's genuine dialogue, is to say, well, look, do these systems have it? We need them. They're not avoidable. But are they functioning properly? Are they loose enough so that people can move? Are they serving the broader good? Or have they degenerated into something that's too tyrannical? Now, you kind of pointed to both of those in the way you formulated that question, because you said, look, well, my mom was in the hospital and she needed care. And I found a surgeon who was an excellent surgeon. And so what you did there basically was take a bow you bowed before the functional hierarchy of the hospital and said, look, the greatest surgeon actually rose to the top, and thank God for that, because otherwise my mother would be dead. It's like, yes, that's a competency hierarchy. And it could be contaminated by tyranny, in which case it would be the brother of some powerful person who ended up with a surgical position, right? And then everyone dies. And that does happen in many, many cultures where nepotism or connections define your position on every axis. But then you said, well, but I went out of the hospital and I was driving down the road and I saw what appeared to be a misallocation of resources. Mm-hmm. And what we have to do about that is have a discussion about it constantly. It's like, are we allocating resources to the appropriate place? Now, the other lurking problem there is, to what degree do we decide about the allocation of resources by voluntary effort, by planning, and to what degree do we let the market take care of it? And that's also something that continually requires negotiation.
Yeah, that market, mate. We can't trust that.
Well, that's the question. Is
people talk about it like it's a neutral thing, but it's just a conglomeration of interests of the powerful.
Well, it's a bunch of things. I mean, it's that. It can be that, but it can also be the way that we collectively value things. Like, let me give you an example.
Yeah, but look at our collective values, and I'll just quickly say this.
Yep.
Because I heard this thing in Sweden. They regulate and control access to alcohol at a state level. Like off licenses or liquor stores, they're sort of socially run, and like they're not allowed to be advertised in Sweden. You know, Sweden, I guess, is one of those havens of what you might. I don't know what your views are of Sweden, but I see a lot of stories about Sweden that seem a bit like. I don't know, Sweden comes across as, a sort of this postmodern democracy almost in some respects. Anyhow, I thought it was curious that they control alcohol in that manner. And I envisaged that sort of breweries and liquor distributors would say, hey, that's not free market. You're controlling access to, people's access to alcohol. As if somehow the free market was neutral. But there is no neutral. If the market is what has the power, people's desires will be overly stimulated. If people have McDonald's advertised at them or alcohol advertised at them, people will bloody eat McDonald's and alcohol. There has to be some moralizing force. There has to be something that's not economically led, that's not the manifestation of greed, that's in the conversation. Someone in a secular society where there is no reasonable or trusted voice of God has to be able to say, don't drink too much alcohol or eat too much McDonald's, because otherwise people will.
Okay, so see, I think the most effective solution to that problem is to have the economic system run, let's say, by distributed individuals who are themselves aiming at a higher good. So I think the most effective way of regulating the market, so to speak, is to improve the moral character of the people who make up the market rather than directly regulating the market. And not that the market doesn't necessarily need some regulation, because you might say, well, how about we don't devote alcohol advertising to children under 10? Most people would agree that that's a reasonable perspective. And so that is limitation on market forces. And there are places that you can find that limitation being accepted by almost anyone. But part of what you're pointing to is that if the only thing that's governing the market is concern for pure market success, then the market can produce all sorts of excesses. But I think what you want is to help orient people towards a transcendent good that's over and above market interest. So you might say, well, what interest should you serve as you're trying to be successful as a comedian, and while you're trying to make a living as a comedian, say? You might want to make sure that you're conducting yourself appropriately in the marketplace. You're concerned about yourself, but also your future selves, because you have to take, and that's partly why addiction is such a catastrophe, right? Because it's great in the short term, but it's not so good in the medium to long run. So you have to take care of yourself and your iterations through the future. You have to take care of yourself in a way that you're taking care of your family. You have to take care of yourself and your family in a way that you're benefiting the community. And that should be foremost in your mind. So then when you start to make economic decisions, even in your business, you're not saying, well, I'm going to do whatever I can to make as much money as I can. You're going to say, I'm going to do whatever I can to make as much money as I can, while also making sure that I'm taking care of myself and my future selves and my family and my community, and being like grateful for all of that and serving it properly. And then I think the market can work more effectively, but still might require some discussion around the edges, because nothing is simple. So the reason that I'm concentrating on the individual and individual development is because I think that's the best way to do that regulation.
I think that's important. I think it's non-negotiable. I think it's necessary. But I also believe that if you have a society that's predicated on some of the worst aspects of human behaviour, lust, desire, fear, if lust, fear and desire are so high in the mix, if you're continually being prompted towards onanism and consuming, I think it's that individual improvement will be insufficient. I feel that your success is... But I don't know what it's based on, but I feel that to a degree you've contacted people on, oh yeah, I can improve my own life, I can have a bit of personal authority and autonomy, and I think that's hugely positive. But if every time you step out of your house, every time you interface with society or pick up your phone or look at a screen, the aspect of yourself that's being nurtured, that's being invited to participate, are the lower aspects of your nature, because those are the most successful routes to a person's decision-making impulses, then I think that it's difficult to exceed. I think it's difficult for these individual projects to succeed. I think that certain people will that message will take hold, but others it won't. So to some degree, I feel like I ain't like a big fan of regulation. I understand your irritation about what's being like this sort of a postmodern deconstructionalist argument of let's destroy God, let's destroy all categories, man, woman, none of it's real. I believe in essence, the humours, the deities, the gods. I feel these things are present. But I feel that we're already being subject to a kind of invisible tyranny, that it's already happening. And I don't think it's happening as a result of like some critical theory, post-Marxist. Like, I feel that that's not where power is. That feels like it's sort of bullshit. We could but it doesn't feel like it's as fucking powerful as GlaxoSmithKline or like, it's not as powerful as Halliburton or like, that's what I'm interested in is power. Real power, and how power is functioning and how power is negatively impacting ordinary people.
Well, I think it's perfectly reasonable to point out that there might be multiple ways that people experience tyrannical oppression. Because every hierarchy is going to tilt towards tyrannical form in its own particular way. And so I've been concerned about what's happening in the university on the radical left. And your concern, the concern that you just brought up, is something like overwhelming large-scale corporate dominance. And I think that's also a reasonable set of concerns. It might not be for the best, for example, that all of our communication is filtered through Google. That might be a bit too much. The question is, the question always is what we can do about it. And I think there's an answer to that, actually. The answer is we can leave people's ability to communicate untrammeled. And so that's why I'm an advocate of free speech. We can leave people's ability to communicate untrammeled so that we can have intelligent discussions about those problems as they emerge and hopefully work towards solutions. Because we can't just generate a structure of rules that says, well, here's the 10 rules that are going to deal with that complex situation. Because things change too rapidly for that. And the reason that freedom of speech, as far as I'm concerned, is the paramount freedom, the paramount right, also the paramount moral obligation, is because it's through our ability to exchange exchange honest opinions that we participate in the process that enables us to keep tyranny of the sort that you described and the sort that I described at bay. And so part of the reason that I've taken the tack I have politically is because, well, my government had the gall to implement compelled speech legislation without noticing what it was that they were interfering with. Because you might say, well, that's pretty much the end of it. How do you keep tyranny at bay? The proper exchange of ideas between free individuals keeps tyranny at bay. That's the best we've got. It doesn't work perfectly. And it's also, I think, a gift that England, in large part, has given to the rest of the world, to formalize and codify that, to put it into a body of law, to erect governmental structures that are really predicated on that idea. It's a remarkable achievement, and it's something we should be profoundly grateful for.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about I was taking that, accepting praise on the behalf of England there. As an English person, I accept that. There are two dragons then. There is the inner and the, at least until we reach some non-dualistic utopia where everything is one. There is the inner dragon of our own desires and fears. But I suppose, like when we're talking about management of resources, is that a phrase that came up earlier? Like that where where does the attention need to go? And it's difficult. Like, me, I suppose there's something about my background that has led me to identify as the dragon. Oh, it's consumerism. It's turning people into consumers, because obviously as an addict, that's what I am, a consumer, an ultra consumer. And it seems that you, with your background in academia, this neo-Marxist post, because like when I sort of like think about aspects of socialism, e.g., people are working too hard, you should only work 4 hours a day, there should be time for fishing in the afternoon, which I think is in Das Kapital. I think he talks about fishing in the afternoon. For me, that seems like a very beautiful and fair and just idea. Also, I don't see them, like, whilst I can imagine that they're irritating on a campus, particularly for somebody who's researched such a lot, I don't see them as powerful. That's part of my intrigue. I suppose it's comparable to when I was talking to Sam Harris, another person who I admire, but whom I go, oh yeah, but I don't like, when I'm talking to Sam Harris about Islam, I go, yeah, but how is Islam gonna, I feel like even if you talk about Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism, like Saudi Arabia is an economic entity, they're not an Islamic entity in terms of let's go do some Islam. It's like let's go do some business, no? And so I suppose here,
I'm concerned mostly. I'm concerned mostly with the emphasis on the collective identity rather than the individual identity. Like the process that you just described, I would say, and this is the answer to the question that you posed at the beginning of our conversation: is there something universal about the process that you laid out? And I think there is. And I think it's at the core of individual development. And I think it's the most powerful of forces. And so I think that the individual should be regarded as the proper locus of evaluation. And the problem I have with the postmodern neo-Marxist types, apart from the fact that their analysis tends to lead to a kind of nihilism, is that because they're making the group the paramount level of analysis, this sort of thing gets ignored. And what I'm trying to do in my work, we have a program called the self-authoring program that kind of steps people through these 12 steps that you just described. The first thing that people do is write about their past, all the emotional experiences. The second thing they do is take an inventory of their personality faults and virtues so that they can rectify the faults and capitalize on the virtues. And the third thing they do is chart a course for the future that takes them into account and others. And I see it as a reflection of this universal process that you just described. And I think it's the most powerful form of transformation. But more importantly, I also think it's the one that risks doing the least harm. Like, it hasn't hurt anybody that you've put yourself together. It's just good, right? It's good for you. It's good for the people that know you. There's nothing about it. And it's the right level of humility, because you took what you knew to be wrong in your experience. You took personal responsibility for it. You made changes for yourself. You didn't go around pointing the finger at what was wrong with the external world and trying to fix it. Now, look, it could easily be that once you have your act together, or maybe even before, you should be doing some things to adjust political systems or sociological systems. But the problem with that is, what makes you think you can trust yourself? And it's like, well, I'm compassionate. It's like, maybe you're also envious of the successful. And the probability of that's pretty damn high, by the way. And so you better know before you express that compassion, especially in the political domain, whether or not that is contaminated by things about yourself that you haven't contended with.
Do you think an honest declaration along those lines, or specifically that, in the political field would be refreshing?
Look, I'll tell you this is a very funny thing. So the emperor of ancient Mesopotamia. So this is some of the earliest political documentation we have, by the way. Here's what they used to do to the emperor. Every New Year's Day, they would take him outside the walls of the city. So he was responsible for everything within the walls. Outside was chaos and the unknown. They'd take him outside the city. They'd strip him of all his emperor garb, so he's no longer emperor. They'd make him kneel. They'd humiliate him. I think, if I remember correctly, the priest would hit him with a glove and say, okay, in the last year, name all the ways that you didn't embody Marduk. Marduk was the god of the Mesopotamians, and Marduk was the thing that took on the great dragon of chaos. And so it was the responsibility of the emperor to kneel down and say, here's all the ways that I haven't been acting out my proper self and have brought the kingdom into disarray. and then he would be forgiven. They would act out the reconstruction of the cosmos. That was the New Year's celebration. And then he'd go in and try to be a good king.
I like that.
So yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. It's like the confession of the emperor. Here's the way I haven't been good.
Are there any comparable, are the powerful held up to that kind of evaluation in
We don't have
any
rituals
form
for
now?
that. Well, I
Because
think
we don't acknowledge the emergence of order from chaos. We don't acknowledge divine principles. So the powerful, and I think this is possibly because of an assumed meritocracy. That people that are in positions of power, they're there for a reason. You don't need to start stripping them naked and taking them outside the city and saying, "How often did you wank in that Oval Office every day?" Get out.
Yeah, well, I think there might be something to that, and that's the danger of pride that goes along with ascension in a hierarchy. Well, because I'm here in this position, I must deserve it. It's like, but there should still be something that you're bowing down to, and that might be the abstract idea of sovereign authority itself, if you think about it only psychologically. But that's a figure that essentially has a touch of divinity about it. Because it's the
monarchy.
perfect ideal.
We're in a monarchy right now, huh? So that's the queen, the anointed and appointed monarch. She represents, but I suppose in a post-secular nation, she becomes the emblem of Britain rather than the emblem of God on
Right. Well,
Earth.
I think it actually functions to some degree in
The same way.
Well, I do think so, because the queen, your queen in particular, our queen as well, because I'm Canadian.
Yeah, you're Canadian.
I think
That's
Elizabeth has been an embodiment of moral virtue. I mean, she's done a remarkable job over the last, 75 years now. She's held herself to an incredibly high moral standard. And I think she does sit in the background as emblematic of what sovereign authority might look like.
But of course, you're postmodernist, and this is an area where, because I'm English and I can't get away from the love of the Queen. But I would also say that she is an emblem of authority and of power and of wealth and land ownership, and that there is an order that ought be respected and can't be challenged. Every so often, this country sort of toys with the idea of republicanism. They're always grateful when there's a wedding, like there is this week, so that no one has to think, "Is this right that we're paying for this bizarre this spectacle?"
Yeah, well, but it is useful to think about it in a symbolic sense. I mean, one of the things that constantly threatens the United States, I think there should be 4 branches of government: legislative, judicial, executive, and symbolic. Because the problem in the United States is the president keeps tilting towards king. The Americans like the idea of the first family and the first lady, and it's like, no, and it kind of tilts towards a dynasty, and you've seen that happen with the Bushes and the Clintons. And it's not a good thing. And it might be nice to have someone take the symbolic load off the president and just act that out. And your queen does that very nicely, because all of the pomp and circumstance of the state and all the drama and ritual of the sovereign can be played out in that sort of dramatic space, and your legislature and executive branches can go off and do the administration.
It's interesting that the dynasties exert themselves. In a sense, it's a demonstration of your argument that there are certain hierarchical systems that find their way into fruition regardless of regulation. But then I suppose there's rational reasons. They would have the resources, the experiences, the connections.
Sure, it's easier for them, but that's also that's a danger to a republic, is the fact that, and it's part of the potential corruption of the state, is that, well, it's easier for the children of those who have authority to have power. And you don't want people attaining the pinnacle of achievement because of power. You want them attaining the pinnacle of achievement because of competence. Yeah. And those things always struggle. It takes a society that's very awake to stop the hierarchies from degenerating into hierarchies of power.
Because degeneration is the tendency.
Sure. Well, it's easy. It's easy.
You quote that
right?
W.B. Yeats poem, that fearsome and terrifying, the Falconer poem.
Well, and people have recognized that it's the proclivity of hierarchies towards tyranny for thousands of years. I've seen that as a fundamental danger to proper adaptation. We need hierarchies, yes, but they degenerate into tyranny and they unfairly oppress. It's like, yes, we have to be on guard against that. But that doesn't mean that we call all hierarchies tyrannies, because that's not helpful, or we call all productive activity service service to the oppressive patriarchy, because that's seriously not helpful. And we don't dispense with hierarchies, because then people don't have anything to do. So,
yes. So it's get the beam out your eye, huh? Like so if the individual is attuned, if the individual is a channel, I like the prayer of St. Francis. I like it as a model that it invites us to find the reverse of each defective characteristic or sin that we might be living out, to become a channel of some inherent goodness.
The thing that's one of the things that's interesting about that, well, two things actually. The first is the word sin means to miss the target. It's an archery term. So that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, because it means that
there is a target.
There is a target. That's the thing. But the next thing is, and this comes right out of that, is it's very useful to become aware of your faults, because as soon as you posit a fault, you posit the opposite. By merely saying, well, that's a fault, you're saying implicitly, well, there's something that's the opposite of that. So out of your recognition of faults, immediately some clarity of virtue develops. Because you might say, well, this is a fault and I really know it. It's like, great, you've got some bedrock there. Whatever the opposite of that fault is, you might not know what that is, but whatever the opposite of that fault is a virtue. And then you might say, well, I have 20 faults. It's like, great. The opposite of the personality that has all those 20 faults is the virtuous you, whatever that might happen to be. Well, great. Then you've conjured out of the devil a redeemer. It's something like that.
I like that. Undoubtedly, both in terms of cosmology and fleeting morality, there is chaos, there is vastness. But there are also patterns. There are patterns that emerge, and whether you call that pattern male or love or beauty, there are various patterns. And I feel that there is something to get in alignment with. There is a tune, there is harmony, there is melody, there is grace. We're not
That's all
dealing
expressed
with
in
just
music,
nothingness.
and all you're using there are musical what would you call it? Analogies or musical representations. That's what music expresses, is to have all of that in harmony.
Yes,
and people
beyond
love
language.
music because of that. And those patterns, because music, you think about music, it is the harmonious interaction of patterns. And you just described all those positive, what would you call them, spirits, that's a good way of thinking about it, as patterns. Well, they are patterns. And then you might think that there's a pattern that's composed of all of those patterns. Well, that's what you're after. You're after the pattern that's composed of all those patterns. Yes, absolutely. And you want to put yourself in harmony with that. And that is a real thing. That's a real thing. You can feel that. So it's what keeps you alive, essentially, when you're trying to become conscious.
Yes, there is something important happening. I feel that, like what we were saying before about the acknowledgement of difference needn't infer inferiority. That is something that we must
definitely
invite.
not. Well, we should be actually. Well, and this is part of what the radical leftists keep saying is, well, we should celebrate diversity. It's like, yes. But what that means first is the admission that people actually differ. Otherwise, you don't have diversity. It's like, I'm glad there are conservatives. I'm glad there are leftists. The conservatives run things. The leftists invent them. It's like, good. And they're really different, those people. Like, if you have a group that's all conservatives and they're going down the right path, they're going to go down that path really fast. But if they're going down the wrong path, they're not going to be able to think laterally and figure out how to get out of it. If you have a group of left-leaning creative types, it's like they're going to come up with 100 ideas. But the probability that they'll organize in a stable hierarchy and implement those effectively is zero. So they're going to have to call over the conservatives. It's like, look, guys, we finally got a good idea. You can have one idea, because you're conservatives, run with it. And then they can all run with it. And so it's really good that we have people who are like that on both sides of the distribution, because otherwise the creative types would sit around and come up with new ideas till they starved to death in squalor.
Those
and
potheads.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the conservatives would just ossify and run down a road that got narrower and narrower and narrower, and they'd all end up stuck between two cliffs. And that'd be the end of it for both of them.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. We require synthesis. This is so. Perhaps
and that's the interplay of opposites, actual opposites.
Yeah. The yin yang. The sort of yes. There needs to be necessary collusion between distinction, but for that to happen, there needs to be acknowledgement and recognition of difference.
Yes.
But in trying to achieve equality with the annihilation of category is not a successful route.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That is
Cool.
not a successful route.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Jordan Peterson. We have good chats, don't we?
That was great. Yeah, that was really good.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Thanks
man.
for inviting me back again.
Oh no, thank you for your time. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you.